There is a truth most people never say out loud, and it will make you uncomfortable. The deepest distance you can create is not from strangers but from your own family. If that feels heavy, good, because this is not about comfort, it is about truth. There is something rarely acknowledged about empaths, the people who feel everything more deeply than others. They love harder, give more, and carry emotional weight that no one else sees. And ironically, they are often the ones who walk away from the very people they were taught never to leave. Not because they are cold or ungrateful, but because they finally understand something important. Love should never destroy you. From childhood, many empaths grow up as silent observers of emotions. They sense tension before words are spoken. They become the emotional glue in situations that are not their responsibility. Even as children, they learn to read moods and adjust themselves. They are often praised for being mature and understanding, but what looks like maturity is actually emotional survival. They are learning how to stay safe in emotionally unpredictable environments. As they grow older, this pattern deepens. They become the ones who listen when no one listens back. They stay when leaving would be easier. They carry conversations, emotions, and silences that belong to others. And slowly, without realizing it, they begin to lose touch with their own emotional limits. At first, it does not feel wrong. It feels normal. Helping others feels like love. Sacrificing feels like loyalty. Staying feels like duty. But over time, something shifts. The emotional weight starts to accumulate. Every ignored feeling, every silent hurt, every excused behavior adds up until one day they realize they feel drained. Not just tired, but emotionally empty. And this is the moment everything starts to change, because they begin to ask a question they never asked before. Why do I feel worse after being around the people who are supposed to love me? That question does not have an easy answer, but it opens a door they can no longer close. Empaths do not walk away because they lack love. They walk away because they have been giving love without receiving emotional balance. They realize they have become the support system for everyone else while no one supports them. And this is where emotional overload begins. It does not arrive as a single moment. It builds quietly through small repeated experiences. Every time they say I am fine when they are not. Every time they ignore their own needs. Every time they justify painful behavior just to keep peace. They start believing this is normal, but their body knows the truth. Exhaustion builds in ways sleep cannot fix. It shows up as emotional heaviness. Simple conversations start feeling heavy. Family calls feel like pressure. Even silence feels loaded. And still they do not leave because empaths are conditioned to understand others before themselves. They try to analyze behavior. They search for reasons behind hurtful words. They protect others even while damaging themselves. They say things like they did not mean it, they are just going through something, I can handle it. But each time they repeat I can handle it, they move closer to a limit they do not see coming. And when that limit arrives, it does not announce itself. There is no warning, no dramatic break, just a quiet internal shift. Something inside them goes silent. They stop reacting as before. They stop explaining. They stop trying to fix everything. This is not anger. It is detachment. And detachment is what confuses people around them because others are used to their effort, their understanding, their emotional availability. So when that changes, it feels sudden. People ask, why are you acting like this? But what they do not see is that this did not start now. It started long ago in every moment they ignored themselves. Every moment they stayed silent. Every moment they chose peace over honesty. Now the result is visible. When empaths reach this stage, something fundamental shifts. For the first time, they begin to choose themselves, not out of selfishness, but out of necessity. And that is where the real shift begins. Not as a dramatic decision, but as a quiet internal awakening that slowly changes how everything feels. For the first time, they stop moving purely on habit and start noticing their own emotional patterns. What used to feel normal now feels questionable. What used to feel like love now feels complicated. At this stage, empaths begin to see something they were never taught to recognize clearly. Family is not always emotionally safe just because it is family. This realization does not come easily because it clashes with everything they were raised to believe. They were told that loyalty means staying, that gratitude means tolerating, that love means enduring no matter what. So even when something feels wrong, they try to explain it away. But the body does not lie, even when the mind tries to. It reacts before logic can interfere. A name on the phone creates tension. A message creates hesitation. A planned visit creates exhaustion before it even happens. And still they go through with it because guilt is powerful. They tell themselves it is normal, that they are overthinking, that this is just how families are supposed to be. Inside these interactions, emotional inconsistency becomes the silent stress. One moment there is warmth, the next there is criticism. One day there is acceptance, the next there is distance or judgment. Nothing is openly violent, nothing is clearly abusive, yet something feels unstable. And that instability confuses the nervous system more than anything else. Because the mind tries to find logic in it. It says, maybe I misunderstood, maybe I am too sensitive, maybe I should adjust. So they adjust. They become quieter in conversations. They choose words more carefully. They measure reactions before speaking. Slowly they start editing themselves in places that should have allowed them to be fully themselves. This is how emotional suppression begins. Not through force, but through adaptation. They learn what is acceptable to say and what is safer to hide. They learn which emotions create peace and which emotions create discomfort. And over time they start choosing peace over honesty, even when it costs them their inner stability. What makes this even more difficult is that nothing appears obviously wrong on the surface. There are no clear signs that others would easily recognize. There is no dramatic event that can justify their internal discomfort, so they begin to doubt themselves. If nothing is wrong, why do I feel so drained? That question becomes a silent burden, because deep down they already sense the answer but are afraid to accept it. It is not one big moment causing the pain. It is the accumulation of countless small moments where they ignored themselves to keep things smooth. Every time they swallowed their feelings, every time they avoided conflict, every time they stayed quiet instead of expressing discomfort, something inside them weakened. Not suddenly, but gradually, like erosion. And over time, they lose connection with their own emotional voice. Empaths are especially vulnerable to this because they are naturally tuned into others. They feel tones, intentions, and unspoken emotions. So even when words sound fine, they pick up the emotional undercurrent beneath them. A compliment can carry judgment. Advice can carry control. Silence can carry disappointment. This constant emotional scanning creates exhaustion, not because they are doing too much physically, but because their mind never fully rests. They are always interpreting, adjusting, processing, and the human system was never designed to stay in that state permanently. Eventually, something starts to break internally. It is not sudden anger or visible collapse. It is withdrawal, a quiet pulling back. They stop engaging with the same intensity. They stop explaining themselves repeatedly. They stop chasing emotional clarity from people who never provided it consistently. And this is where others begin to notice. Not immediately, but eventually. The empath who once responded quickly now takes time. The person who once explained everything now stays silent. The one who once stayed available now becomes distant. This change confuses people because they were comfortable with the old version, the version that tolerated, adjusted, and absorbed everything. So when that version disappears, they react. They say you have changed. You are not the same anymore. You are being distant. But what they are really responding to is boundary. For the first time, the empath is no longer overextending to maintain emotional balance for everyone else. And when that stops, imbalance becomes visible. This is also the stage where guilt begins to appear more aggressively. The empath starts questioning their own decision. Maybe I am overreacting. Maybe I should go back. Maybe I misunderstood everything. Because emotional conditioning does not disappear instantly. It pulls them backward toward familiarity. But something has already changed. Awareness. Once you see the pattern of emotional inconsistency clearly, you cannot unsee it. Even if you return, the awareness remains. Every interaction now carries weight it did not carry before. Every silence feels louder. Every inconsistency becomes more obvious. This creates an internal conflict. One part of them wants comfort and familiarity. The other part refuses to ignore what it now understands. And this tension becomes the turning point. Because staying the same way no longer feels possible, even if leaving feels difficult. And this is exactly where the shift deepens. Not toward chaos, but toward clarity. They begin to realize something important. They were not difficult. They were not too sensitive. They were simply emotionally overloaded for too long without balance. That realization does not bring instant peace, but it brings truth. And truth changes direction. It slowly pushes them towards something they have never fully experienced before. Emotional self-awareness that does not depend on external validation. And once that begins, everything starts to reorganize itself internally, even if life outside still feels uncertain. The moment this internal awareness settles, something subtle but powerful begins to happen. They stop reacting automatically and start observing. Instead of immediately absorbing everything around them, they begin to pause for a second longer. And in that small pause, clarity starts to form. For the first time, they see the pattern instead of just living inside it. They notice how often they were the one adjusting, how often they were the one calming things down. How often they were the one carrying emotional responsibility that was never equally shared. And this realization is not loud, but it is undeniable. It is at this point that emotional fatigue becomes more visible. not just in moments of conflict, but even in normal interactions. Conversations that once felt natural now feel heavy. Familiar voices now carry emotional weight. Even neutral situations feel slightly draining because their system is no longer running on automatic tolerance. Empaths in this stage often start to question their own identity inside relationships. Who am I when I am not fixing everything? Who am I when I am not absorbing everyone's emotions? Who am I when I stop adjusting myself for others? These questions do not have immediate answers, but they mark the beginning of something new. Because until now, their sense of self was built around emotional responsibility. Being understanding, being available, being the one who holds things together. But now that structure is weakening, and underneath it, something unfamiliar is emerging. A version of them that is not constantly in service of others. This transition is not smooth. It comes with internal resistance. The mind tries to return to old patterns because those patterns feel familiar, even if they were exhausting. So they find themselves slipping back into over-explaining, over-giving, over-adjusting. But now there is awareness watching it happen, and awareness changes everything. They begin to notice how often they minimize their own feelings just to avoid discomfort, how quickly they dismiss their own emotional reactions in order to maintain peace, how often they prioritize understanding others while leaving themselves emotionally unattended. And slowly a difficult truth becomes harder to ignore. They were not just being kind, they were overextending themselves beyond healthy limits. This is also the stage where emotional contradiction becomes clearer. Because from the outside, nothing seems obviously wrong. People around them may still expect the same behavior. They may still assume emotional availability. They may still treat them as the stabilizer in every situation. But internally, something has changed. They no longer recover as quickly after emotional interaction. They no longer feel neutral after conversations. Even small exchanges leave a trace of fatigue. And that is because their internal capacity is no longer silently absorbing everything the same way it used to. At this point, emotional exhaustion starts turning into emotional distance. Not because they want to disconnect, but because they can no longer sustain constant emotional output. They begin to step back slightly. Not fully withdrawing yet, but no longer fully engaging either. And this is where confusion begins for others. People who were used to consistent emotional availability suddenly feel a shift. They notice less explanation, less patience, less emotional participation. And instead of understanding the reason, they often interpret it as change in attitude. You are different now. You are becoming distant. You are not the same person anymore. But what they are really witnessing is not personality change. It is emotional recalibration. The empath is no longer operating from overflow. They are operating from limitation. And this is uncomfortable for both sides. Because when empaths stop overgiving, relationships that were built around their emotional effort begin to feel unstable. The balance that once existed was not mutual, it was maintained. And now that maintenance is reduced, the imbalance becomes visible. This is also the point where guilt becomes stronger, because empaths are naturally wired to reflect on their impact on others. So even when they are protecting themselves, they begin to wonder if they are hurting others in the process. That inner dialogue becomes constant. Maybe I am being too distant. Maybe I should go back. Maybe I misunderstood things. Maybe I am the problem. But alongside guilt, something else is growing. Self-awareness. They start recognizing that emotional exhaustion was not random. It was the result of long-term imbalance. They start understanding that constantly prioritizing others while neglecting themselves was not sustainable. And this understanding is not comforting at first. It feels heavy because it redefines many relationships they once trusted without question. It forces them to reconsider what they called love, loyalty, and family connection. Because real connection should not leave someone consistently drained. As this realization deepens, their behavior continues to shift. They stop over-explaining their emotions. They stop justifying every boundary. They stop engaging in emotional cycles that lead nowhere. And slowly they begin to create space where their nervous system can finally breathe. But this space is unfamiliar. It feels empty at first because they are used to emotional intensity, even if it was draining. So silence feels strange, distance feels uncertain, stillness feels uncomfortable. Yet within that discomfort, something important begins to form. Stability. Not external stability, but internal. A growing sense that they are no longer required to abandon themselves in order to maintain connection. And that realization slowly changes how they view every relationship in their life. They begin to see which connections require constant sacrifice and which ones allow balance. And once they see that clearly, their choices start to change, not suddenly, but steadily. Because awareness without change is only observation. But awareness with acceptance becomes transformation. And this is where the empath begins to move from emotional survival into emotional clarity, even if the journey is still unfolding. This stage of clarity does not arrive with excitement. It arrives quietly, almost like a realization that has been building for a long time without permission to surface. The empath begins to understand something they were never taught directly but always felt deep inside. Emotional peace should not require constant sacrifice. And yet, for years, that is exactly what they lived with. A pattern where love was mixed with pressure, where care came with emotional cost, where belonging required self-adjustment. It was never obvious enough to be questioned openly, but it was consistent enough to shape their entire emotional behavior. Now, with distance growing internally, they begin to revisit their past interactions with a new awareness. Not to blame, but to understand. They remember moments where they stayed silent to avoid tension. Moments where they explained themselves repeatedly hoping to be understood. Moments where they gave more, thinking effort alone would create balance. But balance never came that way. Instead, what formed was dependency on their emotional availability. People became accustomed to their patience, their understanding, their willingness to absorb discomfort. And because that pattern worked for others, it continued for years without question. Now that pattern is breaking. And when it breaks, it creates discomfort not only for them, but for everyone around them. Because relationships that relied on emotional overgiving suddenly feel different. The empath is no longer filling every silence, no longer smoothing every conflict, no longer carrying emotional weight that was never shared equally. And that absence is noticeable. People begin to respond. You have changed. You are not the same anymore. You are becoming distant. These statements often come not from understanding but from disruption. Because what changed is not their kindness but their availability. For the empath, this is a difficult moment. Because they are not trying to hurt anyone. They are simply no longer able to function in the same overextended way. But when people react to that shift, guilt returns. And guilt is familiar. It has been part of their emotional identity for a long time. So they question themselves again. Am I doing the right thing? Am I being too cold? Am I breaking something that I should be fixing instead? But beneath the guilt, there is something stronger growing. Self-recognition. They begin to see clearly that emotional exhaustion was not random. It was accumulated. Years of saying yes when they wanted to say no. Years of staying available when they needed rest. Years of prioritizing harmony over honesty. And this recognition brings a shift in perspective. They stop viewing their exhaustion as weakness and start seeing it as information. Information that something in their emotional environment was not sustainable. This is where boundaries begin to form, not as aggressive barriers but as quiet decisions. They no longer explain themselves endlessly. They no longer engage in conversations that drain them without resolution. They no longer feel responsible for managing everyone's emotional state. At first, this creates tension. Because people who benefited from their lack of boundaries feel the change immediately. And change that disrupts comfort is rarely welcomed easily. But something important is happening internally. For the first time, the empath is not recovering from every interaction. There are moments where conversations end without emotional collapse. Moments where silence feels calm instead of heavy. Moments where distance feels protective instead of painful. These moments are small, but they are significant. Because they show the nervous system something new, safety without overextension. And slowly this begins to rewire how they understand relationships. They start recognizing that not every connection is meant to be sustained at the cost of self-abandonment. Not every bond requires endurance through emotional imbalance. Not every form of love is healthy just because it is familiar. This realization does not erase emotional history. It does not remove care. It does not turn them cold. Instead, it creates clarity, a clear understanding that love without emotional safety is incomplete. And once that understanding becomes stable, going back becomes harder. Not because they stopped caring, but because they started including themselves in the equation. Now when they think about returning to old patterns, it no longer feels comforting. It feels like returning to emotional depletion. And that awareness changes everything. Distance, which once felt like loss, begins to feel like protection, not from people, but from cycles that erase their emotional limits. They begin to understand that stepping away was not rejection. It was preservation of identity, and within that preservation, something new starts forming. A quieter, more grounded version of themselves. One that does not rely on constant validation. One that does not feel responsible for fixing everything. One that can observe without absorbing. This version is still developing, still learning, still adjusting. But it is no longer disappearing inside relationships. It exists within them without losing itself. And that is the turning point. Because once an empath understands that their emotional well-being is not optional, everything changes. Their choices change. Their boundaries change. Their relationships change. Not all connections survive this shift, but the ones that remain are no longer built on imbalance. They are built on awareness. And at the end of it all, the empath finally reaches a truth that feels both painful and freeing. You cannot heal in environments that continuously require you to abandon yourself. And once that truth is fully understood, they no longer ask whether distance is right or wrong. They simply recognize that it is necessary. Not as punishment, not as escape, but as survival. And from that survival, something stronger begins to grow. A life where they are no longer defined by how much they can endure, but by how much peace they are finally allowed to keep.